Hello, good afternoon. My name is Cupin, and with me is Miss Sofia Tomacruz. I cover Malacanang Palace for Rappler, while Sofia covers Foreign Affairs. We are back. And this time, ang aga-aga natin nag-come back, January 3 pa lang. Start ng year. Because we are here to talk about President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s first trip of 2023, his first state visit of the year, and his first state visit outside of ASEAN to Beijing, China. Umalis siya kanina early afternoon, and he will be arriving in China on the evening of the 3rd, again January 3. Most of his meetings are happening tomorrow, January 4, and he flies out of China on January 5. It's going to be a very quick visit, 48 hours lang daw siya, sabi ng Pangulo kanina. If you have any questions, comments, or if you wanna ask us follow-up questions about what we're going to talk about, you can leave a comment wherever you're watching. Siguro to start this conversation, Sofia, bakit China?
Yeah, let's start with the big question of Bea. Well, first of all, let's talk about China in and of itself, no? Or rather China in relation to the Philippines. China is a very important partner for us, especially on the economic front, which you've mentioned a while ago and you've mentioned in our past stories, no, that is really going to be a major part of this first state visit of President Marcos to China, the economics. So China is one of our most important economic partners. Why? Because it's the Philippines' largest trading partner. It's our largest source of imports. I'm sure you've heard this, but it bears reiterating. No, it's also the Philippines' second largest destination for exports, and it's also the country's second largest number of tourist arrivals, at least in 2019, before the pandemic. So um, you can just imagine the size of or just the amount of money that and trade that flows between the Philippines and China. No? So they're a very, very important partner for the Philippines when it comes to the economic front. And that also makes them, of course, a very important, well, bilateral partner in general. It's China's considered one of our most important relationships, and they're growing increasingly important as well in the context of increased competition between the US and China in the region. But I think so that's the more general aspect, no? But there's also interesting anecdotes to President Marcos's state visit to China. Unlike past presidents, President Marcos has very personal history with China. He went to China in 1974 with his mother Imelda, no, to lay the foundation for his father's visit in 1975, and that's when if you remember those iconic photos of uh Imelda and a younger Bongbong Marcos Jr. Meeting with Mao Zedong, and then the year later he that was the image of the late Ferdinand Marcos himself with Aimee and Irene and Imelda. And that was a very important trip in 1975 because that's when Marcos established diplomatic ties and really formalized ties between the Philippines and China. It's also when they signed the joint communique. So that's like the basis of our relationship with China. And it's also where the Philippines mentioned in a very nuanced way its one China policy. Um, and just on that note about the personal history between Marcoses and China, no. Even after uh the late Marcos was ousted from Malacanang, the family continued to foster very close ties to China, no. And in 2007, the Chinese Foreign Ministry opened a consulate in Ilocos Norte, which we know is a bailiwick of the Marcos clan. And those ties continue to be close today, because even in 2021, for instance, Imelda received an award for promoting friendlier ties and understanding between Philippines and China. And China, of course, was one of the first countries to reach out to Marcos after winning the presidency. So Bea will talk a little bit about the delegation, but then I'm sure she'll point out also that Marcos's older sister, Aimee, is joining. So in a way, it's kind of a full circle again for the family, and it keeps with the theme that we've been talking about a lot, Bea and I, when it comes to Marcos's foreign engagements, of him kind of meeting these familiar names, going back to familiar places that he's been to when he was younger.
Yeah. Dagdag ko
Um,
lang na
yeah, go ahead,
Dagdag ko
Bea.
lang yung interesting dun kasi nabanggit ni Sofia, di ba, na it was the late strongman, the late dictator, the namesake of the current president who established diplomatic ties between the Philippines and China. Yung kung basahin niyo yung New York Times report, dispatch after that state visit of the first President Ferdinand Marcos, ninote din nila na he is establishing ties with China while not forgetting
Mhm.
the major treaty partner of the Philippines, the US. So parang doon din, parang ano din yun, parang major consideration din siya at that point or
The
talk point
US,
din siya na
yeah,
in visiting China, you have to mention or
you
coverage then
still,
also mention the US, no?
yeah. So years later, things have changed, but also some things have stayed the same. There was an interesting line that, and actually, President Marcos referenced this history himself before he left for China earlier today. Now, maybe we can play back what he said about that historic trip when he was departing from Villamar Air Base.
Similar journey to China as a young man several decades ago, and I was witness to a historic milestone in Philippine foreign policy as I accompanied my mother, former First Lady Imelda Marcos, in 1976, as she laid the groundwork for the establishment of diplomatic relations between our two countries. Eventually, my father formally forged in June 1975 that diplomatic agreement.
I-note lang
Yeah,
natin,
there.
nagkamali si President Marcos dyan. Hindi 1976 yung bisita ni former First Lady Imelda Marcos, pero like as Sofia said, 1974. Yun,
Yeah,
nagkalituan.
1 year
Nalito lang
before.
siguro siya
Mhm.
during that
Yeah.
speech.
But yeah, so it's going to be an interesting trip seeing Marcos back in China. Um, and a part of the interesting tidbits about the trip, of course, is the delegation. So Bea, actually, I think you have notes now on who is
Yeah,
going with the president, who is riding in the presidential plane with him, and
yeah.
what we're supposed to expect during the very quick 48-hour stay there.
Yeah. Siguro nabanggit na rin ni Sofia kanina, Senator Amy Marcos, yung manang ni President Marcos or older sister ni President Marcos is joining the presidential delegation for the first time. Kasama din niya ang kanyang quote-unquote secret weapon. Marami ng nickname si former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo in the foreign affairs sphere since he started joining the President Marcos in his trips abroad, parang in Bangkok, familiar friend or surprise friend ang tawag niya kay GMA when he did have that bilateral meeting with President Xi Jinping. This would be former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo's third time joining the presidential delegation, una sa Bangkok for APEC, and then she did join the ASEAN EU summit, the delegation for the ASEAN EU summit in Brussels. And again, she is joining him in China. Also, like I said nga, si Senator Amy Marcos. She heads the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs. So that is also interesting. We'll see what role she plays exactly. It will be assumed na since she's part of the delegation, andun din siya sa mga meetings, not just with Xi Jinping, but the president is meeting with the top three officials, kumbaga, of China. Wala kasing direct equivalence lahat. Parang kumbaga he's meeting with speaker, parang he's the, kumbaga, equivalent siya ng House Speaker sa atin, Speaker Lee, Premier Lee, and of course, Xi Jinping as well. Bukod kay GMA at bukod kay Senator Amy Marcos, kasama din sa delegation, of course, yung several cabinet officials, like Sofia mentioned, they're there also kasi they will be signing the bilateral agreements with their counterparts from China. So kasama doon DOT, DFA, syempre hindi mo feeling mawala ang DFA sa mga foreign visits, DTI, the Trade Secretary will be there, DICT. So, yung sinabi ni President Marcos kanina sa departure speech niya, mga 10 bilateral agreements, DFA said earlier, mga 10 to 14 daw yung isa-sign. Among them, merong durian diplomacy, yung pa-joke na term ng DFA, durian imports, or durian from the Philippines being brought to China. Meron ding digital cooperation, kaya andun ang DICT. Parang reaffirmation lang ng pag-opt-in natin or pag-join natin sa Belt and Road Initiative. Tourism, of course. Nabanggit na rin ni Sofia kanina na parang yung pre-pandemic second largest source of tourist arrivals. In his speech, in his departure speech, President Marcos made it explicit that he wants the Chinese to return to the Philippines for tourism, for investment. So isa din yan sa goals, I suppose, of the state visit. May mga deals din for infrastructure, and of course, yung communication bilateral agreement between the DFA and China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs para one of the main reasons for that agreement para hindi na magkalituan na or hindi magkaroon ng miscommunication over issues such as the West Philippine Sea, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Meron ding sizable quote-unquote business delegation, although we don't know yet kung sinong kasama sa sizable business delegation na yan. I've noted this in stories before. Malacanang doesn't really disclose the full delegation list of the presidential visits, although kung ikaw yung media covering in person, nakikita mo naman kung sino yung mga kasama sa trip. Ano pa ba? So yeah, siguro yung bukod dun sa nabanggit ko na ng konti yung West Philippine Seas, isa rin siguro sa mga elephants in the room sa visit na to. Medyo intense yung surge ngayon sa China. So parang medyo mas intense yung health protocols for this presidential visit. For everyone's information, kunwari kung sasakay ka sa presidential plane, by default kailangan mo talaga mag-present ng negative RT-PCR na test result. Given na yon, pero itong Philippine delegation ngayon, so I'm talking about the officials, so the cabinet officials, the legislators who are joining, the president himself, the first lady, PSG, PMS staff, kung sino-sino pa man, at yung media delegation, they will be in a bubble. So contained lang sila during the whole time they are in Beijing para maiwasan din yung potential exposure to COVID-19. That's one of the kumbaga safeguards that they've placed for the state visit. And the DFA has said nga naman na parang may mga things na or may mga bisita na hindi mo pwedeng i-postpone. Even if you have something as huge as a COVID surge currently in China. So
Yeah. On
check
that
ko yung
note, yeah, I just want to mention that I mean, you mentioned it already briefly, pero because this visit is also happening in the context of that COVID surge, and there's been a lot, no, there's been a lot of news reports about how infections are really surging. You don't really know the true picture of the severity of the situation, but there are reports of hospitals being overwhelmed. So you can just imagine. I mean, it's easy for us, sadly, to imagine what that's like because we've also experienced it here.
Yeah.
But I think that goes to show also not just how important the trip is to the Philippines, and the Marcos administration to push through with the trip despite the difficult situation that's present there in China. Just a brief mention too about some interesting and important deals that we'll be looking out for. So apart from the deal on tourist cooperation, there's also supposed to be the DFA mentioned that there was a lot of interest from Chinese businessmen in areas of renewable energy and agriculture, of course, which are priority areas for the Marcos administration, but also particularly in nickel, which we know is an essential mineral for clean technology. In the Philippines is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the seventh largest source of nickel in the world now, and we were the second or the largest source of nickel for China. And again, it's becoming a very increasingly important mineral for the clean energy transition, but also for in a way, also an aspect of competition between the US and China because there's only so much nickel in the world, and so during Vice President Harris's visit to Manila in November, there was also a deal about nickel and how the US would give assistance to the development and refinement of nickel here in the Philippines. So it would be interesting to see how those two deals play together, if ever. Um, but of course, we can't leave out mention of the West Philippine Sea, which Bea was talking about a while ago, and which will heavily feature during this trip. No, what
Yeah.
the yeah, maybe Bea can talk about that as well.
Before we jump there, parang may nag-comment ata about pangungutang or
Mm.
paglo-loan sa China. The DFA did say na may discussions on possible grants amounting to
$1.3 billion.
approximately so mga 12 billion pesos ata kung i-convert mo. Pero hindi pa natin alam yung details no kasi again, dinisclose lang yun during a press briefing. So hindi natin alam yung kumbaga yung fine print, yung nitty-gritty ng possible bilateral agreements na yun concerning those possible grants. Ang daming possible. Pero hindi pa natin kasi alam yung mismong wording, yung framework nung sinasabi ng DFA na grant. So, but we will be reporting on that once the DFA and the China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs discloses yung kung ano ba yung detalye nung possible grant na yun.
Or investment pledges din, no? Iba din yung investment pledges between the business,
Yeah.
the Chinese businessman and the Filipino businessman.
Yeah. Yes, we also expect that. So, kumbaga sa 4 tomorrow, the president, parang yun yung bulk, actually hindi lang bulk, yun yung lahat ng activities mangyayari. Yung 4 na meetings with the top 3 officials of the government, of the Chinese government, magkakaroon din ng state banquet or state dinner ba yung term? Basta China will host the delegation, but also on the sidelines or siguro sabay, we don't know the exact schedule yet kasi there will be meetings with businessmen, business people, business leaders from China with again yung sinasabi nilang sizable business delegation from the Philippines. So, parang economy talaga yung main agenda na pinoproject ng Philippines. But of course, maraming issue na kumbaga hindi mo pwedeng iwasan. In fact, kanina, ito yung interesting for me, yung speech, departure speech ni President Marcos kanina. He didn't directly allude to it. He didn't directly mention it, but he did allude to it. So let's listen to President Marcos talking about issues between Philippines and China.
I also look forward to discussing political security issues of a bilateral and regional nature. The issues between our two countries are problems that do not belong between two friends such as Philippines and China. We will seek to resolve those issues to mutual benefit of our two countries.
So yung curious ako dito, Sofia, how is China framing this state visit? Like, how do they see the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea issue in the context of Marcos visiting Beijing?
Right. So to answer your question, Bea, well, they frame the visit as essential for cooperation, and that cooperation is increasingly necessary between the Philippines and China. And in that view, the West Philippine Sea then and the South China Sea dispute is only one part of the relationship between the Philippines and China. And it's actually a line that you hear often said by both the Philippines and China. But and while that is true, I think it's also worth remembering that yes, while the Philippines and China relationship is more than just the West Philippine Sea issue, it's really that issue that shapes the view of Filipinos when it comes to China. It's their actions in the West Philippine Sea. It's what they do in the South China Sea, not only to the Philippines but to other neighboring countries, that really shapes the way Filipinos view China and how much they trust China. So it's really a tricky situation, no? And in that sense as well, the agreement will be the agreement. There was an agreement that the DFA mentioned will be signed between the Foreign Ministry of China and the Department of Foreign Affairs, which would be to kind of establish direct communication Is that correct, Ben? On direct communication
Yeah.
between the two agencies when it comes to the West Philippine Sea. So there's a lot of issues, sorry, a lot of questions that were raised in terms of what that might look like, and we'll really only know once it's signed.
Yeah.
Um, but just maybe a brief background, no, on how things currently stand. Usually, the issue is raised when the two countries meet annually, um, and discuss. They discuss it during the bilateral consultation mechanism. That's a meeting that's held um, annually to talk about I mean, many issues, of course, including the West Philippine Sea. Um, there's also, of course, the back and forth when it comes to filing of protests and the answering of protests that were filed. So, um, experts see the agreement as possibly uh, an avenue to increase the frequency of those talks, which on the one side could be um, on the one side raises the question of how productive it will actually be, because already now in the back and forth not much is resolved, or you really have differences that are hard to resolve, because as much as the president, for instance, or any passing administration wants to solve it, um, you're talking about territorial sovereignty, and um, oftentimes it's a non-starter for both countries when you raise the issue, no, of who owns what. On the other hand, on a positive note, you can look at the agreement as perhaps fostering more stability on the issue. So because it's more institutionalized in DFA and in the Chinese Foreign Ministry, then it's less prone to being politicized when it's handled by diplomats. Um, I mean, and even if the agreement is signed during this administration, no, that will carry over into the next and the future administrations as well. Um, Also, but I'm curious, no, Bea, to hear your thoughts as well on um how, because you did mention it was interesting that the president didn't mention the issue explicitly, no, when in fact he's had some clear cut statements in the past, no? For example,
Mm.
about not giving up 1 square inch of territory, which of course was met with standing ovation during his first State of the Nation address.
Mm. Parang yun nga yung interesting. I think, see, this is not my insight, but Jed Rabena's insight, I talked to him for a different show naman. Yun nga, parang, if you remember when, during his working visit to New York for the ONGA, di ba, one of his spontaneous-ish statements, yung I can't imagine a future of the Philippines, this is not verbatim, ha? Basta parang yung gist ay, hindi siya maka-imagine ng future ng Pilipinas na walang US. So parang with that in mind, ano kaya naman yung mga rhetorical devices or ano yung what will he say naman kung kaharap niya ang China while in China. So I think that's one thing that will be interesting, like how will he kumbaga court or how will he affirm the ties of the Philippines and his personal ties rin. Kasi kumbaga yun din yung framing ng DFA in a way na parang bukod sa Manila-Beijing, Philippines-China relations, you have Xi Jinping recently getting a new mandate, Marcos 6 months, would you believe 6 months pa lang, pero ang dami na ng biyahe. Siya rin naman nagsabi kanina, 7th trip niya to in his first 6 months in office. So, parang how this will absolutely set the tone of relations under Marcos 2.0.
Yeah.
Like depending on how he expresses kumbaga, diba, yung commitment to becoming an enemy, friend of all, enemy to none. So yun yung one thing that I am looking forward to. Kasi nga pa yung push and pull ulit ito no, na parang
Yeah.
he is attempting to mend ties that were strained from the previous administration, so US, EU. But of course, he doesn't want China to be alienated by the ties that he's
Yeah.
reestablishing or reaffirming with Western allies. But at the same time, isipin mo rin ano yung perception ng Filipinos, right? Like not just of the rhetoric of the 31 million who voted for him, but yeah, everyone in the Philippines, right? Na parang ano bang perception naman ng Filipino sa ties natin sa China or ties natin sa US. So parang yung balancing, tignan natin kung anong sabihin niya. Kasi yun yung interesting nga rin na parang pagdating niya sa Beijing at kung kaharap na niya sila at public na yung mga speeches. Kasi if you recall, the bilateral, of course, with Xi Jinping was not public, like hindi streamed yun. So when he addresses his Chinese counterparts in front of a camera, like what kind of rhetoric will the Philippines use? Well, the Philippines via Marcos use. So yeah, interested to
Yeah.
see how he's gonna do that.
Yeah, no, I agree na, Be. And you did mention it, no? It really will be that balancing act, which we will see when Marcos makes his visit as he meets with the leaders, no? Because I think another thing to mention, no, is that while this is Marcos's first trip, of course, this is also a lot of people are also looking to how he will, what you mentioned, set the tone of
Mm.
relations under his term, especially coming off of Duterte, na
Yeah.
the Philippines um, so-called pivoted towards China. So if President Marcos is talking about an independent foreign policy, this is really one visit where we'll start to see what that looks like, because we'll see how we sort of saw the tone being set with the US, and now we'll really see how that looks like with China, and also how his personal history might come into play and how it might make
Mm.
things easier or harder or more nuanced or more delicate. I can think of all the words, no, but yeah. But yes, and also balancing um that boost he has from with his personal ties with the fact that there are certain red lines that can't be crossed. So it's also another thing we'll be looking out for now. What red lines will be defined um during the visit between of Marcos to China. So um a lot of things to look out for. A lot of things we'll also be monitoring, and of course, um, we'll have it all for you on our live blog, which you can follow and find on the Rappler website. Please follow that. We'll be giving you blow by blow updates, analysis, and developments as they come. Follow us on Twitter as well, and stay tuned to Rappler for more updates on this visit. We'll see you soon when when Marcus returns as well to talk about the trips and what it gave us.
Bye. Thank you for watching.